And welcome, yes, welcome back or welcome to this series as the case may be. Happy to be with you. And I just want to take a moment to thank you, especially stridently, for taking 90 minutes out of your Microsoft build time. I consider that a huge compliment. This is Becoming a Microsoft Azure Administrator, and as Alyssa mentioned, this is session 2 of 6, Get Up to Speed with Azure IaaS. Let me get up to speed myself by getting my mouse on the appropriate monitor. And let's take a look at what we've got in store for ourselves today. I'm going to present for 50 minutes and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So that's your responsibility. You know, in the cloud computing shared responsibility model, Microsoft takes care of their responsibility and the customer takes care of theirs. Your responsibility, if you don't mind, is to send those questions to me so I can answer them for you. We're going to start today by making sure we're crystal clear on the Azure Infrastructure as a Service use case, starting right at the beginning momentarily. What is IaaS anyway, and why should you care? I'll then do a demo, taking a leaf from last session where a couple of you mentioned that you wanted a bit more depth in the demo. I'm happy to accommodate that. So we'll do a few things to illustrate how infrastructure as a service, also known as virtual machines running in the cloud, functions in Microsoft Azure. And then because the focus of this entire seminar series is that of skills development and hopefully either you're becoming an Azure administrator or continuing your journey, what are some practical tips, tricks, strategies, and homework assignments to help you on your way? All right, here is a blueprint of the entire series. You notice that shifting your paradigm was the first of the 6 sessions. And also, as Alyssa said, let me switch on over to my browser. We're hosting the recordings in the Pluralsight YouTube channel. So head on over to YouTube/Pluralsight and look it up. Their turnaround is really fast. I mean, I think they had session 1 up there the same evening of that session. So I understand that because of the time zone issue, not everybody can make the sessions live. So it's especially important that you know where to find them. Eventually they'll be in the Pluralsight library, always free. And my understanding is you don't even have to have a Pluralsight subscription to see these, but in the short term, you'll find them at YouTube. All right, and then just briefly looking ahead over the rest of what we've got for you in this series, we'll look at platform as a service next week. That's largely Azure App Service and Function apps and Logic apps and just getting comfortable with that ecosystem. Then we'll turn our attention to Azure DevOps, which is pretty perfect to go into after looking at IaaS and PaaS. That's largely the domain of both the Azure administrator as well as the Azure developer. What is DevOps but a union? I like Microsoft's own definition of DevOps, actually, a union of, what is it, processes, people, and tools in the name of delivering value to your customers as efficiently as possible. And then in sessions 5 and 6, they're bookends, just purely focusing down on skills development, theory, practice, and certification. I do also remember from our first session, we had a lot of questions about certification. So although we'll formally treat the subject in session 6, I plan to continue our discussion throughout the whole thing with certification because, you know, certification absolutely has value in any IT endeavor, it seems to me, and we'll go from there. One more housekeeping bit. I'm surprised I don't have the slide handy that I normally show you with all of the exercise files that I'm sharing. I don't know how that disappeared, so I tell you, if you don't mind peeking behind the curtain with me for just a second, I'm going to create a quick slide called Course Materials, and I'm going to pop in good old-fashioned smart art or word art like I normally do. And that's going to be timw.info/admin. And what that link will do is take you, if you haven't already been there, it'll take you out to github.com and specifically a repository that I've put together for this seminar series. So let me again switch over into the browser context because I have that repo loaded up in one of my tabs here. And I have been adding to it as I promised last week in session 1. What the repo looks like today is we've got PDFs of my slide deck from both sessions thus far. And I've also compiled a links list, this session 1 links. It's a markdown file. And I basically went through after our session and I thought about the questions that you asked and the content and everything I might have referenced along the way. And I just kind of dumped that out in a list of, as you can see here, links that are relevant. We talked about building your skills in Azure if you've already got Amazon or Google knowledge, for instance. Some Pluralsight specific helpful links, some Azure administration certification links, etc. So I plan to continue that trend as we work through this. So I suppose by the end of the session, you'll have 6 PDFs and at least 6 additional files with other resources. All right, Arino, I'll make sure to give that link to you at the end of the session as well. Understanding the infrastructure as a service use case. Did we go over this diagram last time? I think we did, but it's helpful, and you can see the attribution URI in the lower left corner of the slide. It's helpful to give us a feeling, just a quick high-level understanding of where on one hand, if your IT is all local on premises, you and your team are responsible for the whole thing, aren't you? From the physical layer of your networking, your servers, be they physical or virtual, your storage subsystem, all of this stuff is your responsibility to buy, lease, maintain, etc. And then, of course, there's the software running on those servers and the applications that you're either developing or purchasing or offering to your users, whoever they may be. And that entire life cycle is your responsibility. That's a lot of work, and it's a lot of fear, isn't it? Especially in today's land of crypto locker attacks, ransomware, and just InfoSec as a whole. Why not begin to take advantage of machine learning algorithms, for instance? If you think about the signal logic that Microsoft gets from all around the world, think of, they've published it in their website somewhere, how many sign-ins they see in Azure and the Microsoft Cloud Platform each day. Just think of all of that intelligence that Microsoft then rolls into machine learning training, building a model to ultimately be able to make very detailed and specific predictions. And why not take advantage of that huge threat intelligence and guidance? Hence, we have the public cloud in general and Microsoft Azure specifically. Infrastructure as a service is our focus today because in my experience, this tends to be the most administrator-friendly topic. If you already have worked as a systems administrator, then you've almost certainly worked with physical and/or virtual servers. When we're hosting these VMs on premises, again, you're responsible for everything, but if you're a Microsoft shop, you probably use Hyper-V as your virtualization or hypervisor layer, or you may be using VMware, vSphere, or both. In all likelihood, you may have both, a little of both, depending upon how big the environment is. And so I see in my experience, businesses tending to go to infrastructure as a service as at least as an initial step, because it tends to involve the smallest degree of paradigm shift, because you're still using, generally speaking, the same management tools, but you're letting Microsoft handle the hyperscale back end. The network, storage, server, virtualization layer is Microsoft's responsibility. And then you're hosting your VMs in that environment. And then, of course, it's up to you to back up and secure the virtual machines and the operating system and applications that's on those virtual machines and go on from there. Moving that abstraction or that split between Microsoft and your responsibility even further, you see we get to platform as a service. I always think as a reference, Azure App Service, hosted web applications or API apps, where most of the infrastructure is abstracted away. You get some control, some visibility, but nowhere near as much as with virtual machines and IaaS. And the value prop here is that you can, again, take advantage more of the geoscale, the hyperscale features that a public cloud provider like Microsoft can give you. And you can focus more on the core value that you're providing your users and your applications. There's a couple layers I could probably shimmy in between platform as a service and software as a service. I believe that came up in yesterday's session, as a matter of fact. Things like containers, using Docker containers and running production services in those. The concept of serverless computing like Azure Functions. We'll get more into that, of course, next week in the next session. But we're just, again, moving that slider, and ultimately software as a service I define as a finished, fully hosted application that if you're using it as a customer, you may get some degree of application programming interface or API access. Think of Twitter, for instance. If you belong to Twitter, they expose their API. You can apply for a developer account and you get an access key, and you can in code make calls into Twitter to fetch tweets and to look at trends, and you get some access, but just about everything else is abstracted away by the provider. And Azure is it's a good platform for your building software as a service that you then unleash to your customers. So there you go. So there's placing IaaS in context. Tends to be a familiar model for many folks. Now, what are some points to ponder? Advantages, disadvantages, etc. An advantage of IaaS is that you can run software that isn't supported elsewhere in Azure. Now, Azure's pretty friendly. I know that it's been a theme in MS Build this year about Microsoft being far beyond the .NET framework or .NET Core. Well, and from an operating system standpoint, of course, there's Windows, but Linux, several endorsed Linux distributions exist in Azure. We'll review those in just a minute, as a matter of fact. An app service, there's lots, like I said, beyond .NET Core. There's support for Python and Java and Node, etc. However, you are limited in terms of which versions are supported. And if you're not on that supported list, you may have to do a virtual machine. That's what I'm trying to say. You also get full stack access if you have needs, business needs, development needs, security needs, to manage the whole stack of your app, that is your OS environment. Okay, VM's a perfectly appropriate use case if you're willing to sign up for that. Also, as I said, there's a familiarity factor. You can access your Windows virtual machines or Linux virtual machines using your traditional tools. Remote desktop protocol, for instance, for a GUI Windows desktop. You can do WinRM PowerShell remoting, depending upon whether you're doing a VPN or express route or coming in over the internet. There's definitely patterns to consider and security proven practices to put in place. But you can keep at least part of your on-prem skills. On the other side, the big trade-off with IaaS is the responsibility that I mentioned, which may or may not be a big deal for you. It becomes a bigger deal I've seen with customers when they start to see some of the platform as a service features, the ability to auto scale your services, and just not to have to worry about a lot of the underlying plumbing of the compute layer. Once you see that there's just this effectively limitless pool of compute available, and you can just dial it up and dial it down to meet your application needs, that's pretty compelling, it seems to me. So a disadvantage is that with IaaS, you're responsible for things like load balancing, high availability, and auto scaling. You need to know what's available in Azure. Microsoft is transparent about their service level agreements, but it's your responsibility to put those into place. And then there's the cost factor for sure. I mean, depending upon how big your application is, if it's a monolith type app that consists of several tiers, and then you want high availability at each of those tiers, that stuff adds up. There's no question about it. Alrighty, how are we doing? Looks like we're doing all right with time. Next, we've got implementing Azure IaaS, and here I'm teeing up for a practical demo. I stressed, in fact, the title of the first session was about shifting your viewpoint or your attitude towards systems administration. I described paradigm as a fundamental shift in outlook. And this slide, I chose this open source picture decidedly because I guess I'm more of a curmudgeon than I might want to admit, but I worry about people entering IT never having wielded a screwdriver. I mean, you see, are you able to recognize all of the hardware in this diagram? Can you see the two different hard drive form factors? Looks like there's a memory stick. It looks in the upper right, it looks like an ancient ISA expansion card. So yeah, the hardware is a little dated in this picture, that's for darn sure. But anyway, to go to the cloud where you're never ever going to get within kilometers or miles probably of an Azure data center, and you'll never need to get anywhere near the hardware, how do you conceptualize the deployment, the configuration, the maintenance, security, management of virtual machines and virtual hardware if you don't have a fundamental platform of knowledge and hopefully even experience in working with real physical storage, CPU, memory? That's a question that I'm more than happy. I've got loads of advice for that, believe me. So just send it into the Q&A panel if you want to follow up on that. What we're looking at here is a diagram from the Azure documentation. Again, attributions in the lower left. I really like to teach from this diagram because it really illustrates the major parts and pieces. Call it the anatomy and physiology of a virtual machine in Azure. Now notice that there's no reference to Windows Server or Windows 10. There's no reference to Ubuntu, Linux, or Core OS because the operating system doesn't matter. These parts and pieces in the Azure Resource Manager are irrespective of the guest operating system in the VM. So we see number one, resource group. This is the fundamental unit of deployment in Azure Resource Manager. Every resource always is associated with a resource group. It's a special container object. Now, the virtual machine is a resource, but it's not the whole enchilada. It's not the whole picture. The VM is where your configuration is stored, for sure. What VM size are you running? How are you kitting or setting up the VM for high availability? What region of the world are you in? What resource? All of that metadata is important, but it's not the whole story. The size piece is because the VM size you choose is going to determine how much physical RAM and CPU and potential for storage you get. And it's just like a menu. The idea is to choose the appropriate size. I've been thinking a lot lately of the old fairy tale, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, with the porridge, too much, too hot, too cold, just right. That's a key Azure administrator task. And how do you get to the point where you can predict how a VM will perform under a given workload? Well, what comes to my mind is two things. One is raw experience. Two is trial and error. And the third thing I'll add, knowing how to monitor Azure resources. And I need to put a little check mark in my brain to include that in our demo that we'll do in a moment. Monitoring, so you can visualize how the different subsystems of your virtual machine are performing. Storage, for instance, we've got a concept in Azure called managed disks. On on-premises environments, you know about the VHD or VMDK, the virtual hard disks. Same idea here. Azure does use Hyper-V, and you might further know if you've used Hyper-V before, the disk format. There's the older Gen 1 VHD, and there's the Generation 2 VHDX that unlocks additional security and performance and capacity. It's been a really slow slog in Azure IaaS to move toward Gen 2 support. It's still pretty provisional, so I tend to go Gen 1 still nowadays. But at any rate, you manage those disks in Azure. It used to be a few years ago that you managed the VM disks in a storage account. And boy, that had some really big issues with it, not the least of which is that if you or your colleagues weren't careful, you could accidentally expose your virtual machine storage for anonymous public access. Ouch. Managed disks are a really good thing. You can resize disks, you can apply whole disk encryption, you name it. I mean, think of doing something like you realize an on-premises physical server is running out of hard disk space. How long is it going to take you to boost? Maybe it's not going to be that much. I mean, I shouldn't curmudgeon out that much. But I'm just saying, when you see how almost trivially easy it is to resize and resection and reorganize your compute in Azure, I don't know, it's a pretty almost magical thing as far as I'm concerned. I love it. So here we see highlighted on the slide the networking. Where does the VM get its networking? It's going to be in a separate resource called, appropriately enough, a Virtual Network Interface Card, or NIC. And another question as an administrator you always should ask if you're asked to give a public internet accessible IP address to your VM is, does it really need? Does that VM really actually need to be exposed directly to the internet? Because I remember back when high-speed internet for consumers first became a big thing in like 97, 98. I remember in those days, if you didn't have your system pretty well tight with anti-malware and a firewall, as soon as you hit the internet, you've got brute force stuff happening on your system. It's like that in Azure because Microsoft actually publishes all of their public IP4 addresses that they own every month. So bad actors already know what those ranges are, and I can promise you they are running port scans looking for public IPs on VMs that have been left open or forgotten about or aren't hardened sufficiently. So that's an important discussion, how you're going to expose your VMs to the internet. Hopefully not at all. There's plenty of good options, and I'll show you one shortly, actually, called Azure Bastion. What else? Let's just jump through the next couple slides quickly here. I want to get to the hands-on stuff. I'll just bring out all 5 of these blocks. What I want to show here is that as of now, we've got support. And when I say support, meaning Microsoft will honor a support request and not say, oh, that's out of support. Windows Server 2019, notice it's the data center SKU for all these. Server 2016 data center, 2012 R2, even as far back as Server 2008 R2 SP1. And you might wonder, why does Microsoft support Windows 10 in an Azure VM? Windows 10 is a client, not a server operating system. Why do you think? There's a good reason for it. At least my understanding of the reason I think is good. It's for testing, I believe. You can do endpoint management with Azure-based products like Microsoft Intune, and you can spin up Windows 10 VMs, or if a development environment, you can spin up a desktop, and frankly, with Windows Virtual Desktop. So you see, there's a place for it, but Windows 10, to my memory, is not available in all Azure subscription offers, so you have to think it's part of the MSDN ones for sure. As I said, nowadays, Linux is supported right alongside with Windows, and Microsoft, I think, covers the major bases with business class Linux like Red Hat Enterprise. There is SUSE and OpenSUSE, there's CentOS and Koros, and even Oracle Linux. Surprisingly, there's not yet a platform-hosted Oracle database. If your needs are for an Oracle database, at this time, you'll need to do that in a virtual machine, actually. What's this? Hybrid cloud management. That's fine. I just want to get into the demo. The first thing I want to show you is a typical use case where you want to prepare a golden image locally in your local environment, you know, a VHD, that's going to serve as a base for future VMs that you want to deploy in Azure. So how would you prepare a golden VHD disk image in your local environment? How would you get it into Azure? And then how can you set it up as an image that you can base new deployments off of? So why don't we tackle that next? Let me bring over this copy of VMware I have running, and let me make this full screen. Okay, hopefully you're seeing Hyper-V Manager. So this is a system in my local environment I have running, and it's a Hyper-V host, and I've created a Windows Server 2016 virtual machine called Win16 template. So again, the use case here is you've set this up exactly the way you want your servers to be in a starting orientation. This is a common, in my experience, a common on-premises local deal. Yes, you may have automation, build automation and all that. I understand that, but we're gonna just take it slowly here. And so we've set that up exactly the way we want, and then we generalized it. Imagine you know what I mean by that. You've run sysprep. So this is going to, if I choose generalize and shut down, I need to make sure not to hit OK. It's going to wipe the computer name, any static information. I like to describe sysprep as an operation of rubbing the fingerprints off of the operating system and put it in a kind of almost an out-of-box experience or UBI state. Now, if you look in the Azure documentation, there's some additional guidance that I'm not going to get into where you can preload the Azure agent, the VM access agent. That's a good thing to have on your template before you put the image up into Azure, because that extension is critical. That is how Azure is able to fundamentally get its hooks into your virtual machines that run there. There are both Linux and Windows Azure VM agents available. and you can download them and install them in your local environment, no problem at all. And Microsoft recommends that Windows, that agent software actually has a sysprep built into it for Linux boxes actually. So you could install the Linux Azure agent on your on-premises Linux machine and then run the agent from a terminal session with a coupled flags. I don't remember what they are, but it does a sysprep. It generalizes the box. Now, this was a generation 2, this Windows 16 template VM was a Gen 2 VM, so it has the VHDX virtual hard disk. We want to run convert VHD. This is one of the Hyper-V PowerShell commands. And all I did, I've already done this work. I'm specifying the path to the VHDX after I sysprepped and shut it down. And then I specified a destination path where I want the Gen 1. All I had to do was specify VHD, and that was enough for convert VHD to know that I wanted to convert from generation 2 to generation 1. And once I had that VHD, I used Azure Storage Explorer, and I just did a simple file upload, but there's a part of the Azure Toolkit. If you just do a search for AZ Copy, you can download this command line tool called AZ Copy that has a lot of really nifty blob transfer capabilities built into it. For instance, it can do like retries and it can do checksumming. It's a pretty cool tool. And as you see here, if I have AZ Copy installed, first you have to sign into your subscription with it. You run AZ Copy login, I think. And then just the simple old school syntax. You specify the source. In this case, it would be my VHD, my Win16 template.vhd file. The destination would be the URI or the web address up in a storage account that I have in my subscription. And specifically, it would be a blob container. And then you need to authenticate to the storage account. Azure storage accounts have 2 API keys that you are encouraged to periodically regenerate because any static secret presents a security hazard, it seems to me. So you authenticate into Azure with your access key. The pattern would be the VHD file name, and then we specify the type of binary large object it is, a page blob. Now, I should have Storage Explorer installed on this system. Again, as you work as an Azure administrator or start to step into the waters, you'll see that there's lots and lots of these add-on tools that Microsoft themselves makes. You can go to azure.com and just look in the top navigation for downloads or tools. You'll find it all there. And Azure Storage Explorer is a free cross-platform desktop app. It's not open source, unfortunately, but it runs exactly the same on Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, and it's a really nice way to interact with your storage accounts. And if you're a developer, it goes even further than that, as you'll see in just a moment. If you have the Azure Software Development Kit installed on your system for your language of choice, you can actually stand up a virtual or a local virtual storage account, and your developers can actually, it's called the storage emulator, and you can have your developers work locally and kind of emulate interacting with your real storage account that's in Azure. Tips like that are important because as it happens with Azure storage accounts, you're actually charged for every REST API call into that storage account. So even a file listing, that's a transaction. Any HTTP request, whether it's create, read, update, or delete, why not save those transactions, work locally, then change your paths when it's time to work with the cloud version, you see? So I have a general purpose storage account called Instructor 704. Let me get these out of the way. And in the blob service, I created a container which kind of sort of functions like a folder called uploaded VHDs, and I already transferred that generalized Win16 template VHD into my storage account. How did I authenticate? Well, you can just simply sign into Azure and choose which subscription or subscriptions you want to view, and then you're in business. Really nice tool. And you know, interestingly, you wind up seeing screenshots from that Storage Explorer a lot on the Azure certification exams for some reason. Think I can get rid of this VMware. So let's come back now to the portal and let's pick it up from there. What we want to do, remember, is ultimately start to create virtual machines based on an image, a disk image. So we can do, in the managed disk system, there's separate blades for disks and images. We'd go to images, which we'll do actually. And we're going to create a new golden image. Now, we're doing this in the Azure portal, but remember, Azure Resource Manager is what's called a REST API. It's an HTTPS-based method for interacting with the service. And the portal is just a web layer on top of the REST API. So if you wanted to do this programmatically with Azure PowerShell, that's just a wrapper of the REST API. If you want to do Azure command line interface, if you're a developer and you're using C# or Python, you just load up the SDK library and .NET Core framework and off you go. It's all abstractions on that REST API theme. I'll call this Win 2016 image, and I'll specify where I want it to live. I'll actually create a new resource group called Pluralsight. Remember, the resource group is ultimately where everything in Azure is deployed in. Our location, I'll specify it as a Windows OS disk, Gen 1, and then we just simply browse out to where our blob is. So in this case, I know that I'm in Instructor 704. I'm in the uploaded VHDs container, and it's Win16 template.vhd. Good deal. Now here's something that's kind of cool. On premises, that server might be really low speed, clunky mechanical storage, but look here, we could make it a premium solid state disk in the cloud. That's what I mean, where you have this enormous toolbox in Azure to work with. Of course, the premium SSD is going to be quite a bit more expensive than standard HDD storage. But again, as an administrator, you want to go beneath the surface a little bit. SSD, besides raw speed, gives you predictable performance. HDD, it's actually kind of variable. So I'll leave that at HDD right now. But the beauty is we can change this. We can create a VM using this image as a blueprint and then later convert to premium disk. We're not locked into any decision here. It's a wonderful thing. We can even add data disks to the image. So when we use the image in a new virtual machine, the data disks come along for the ride. And all of your Azure storage is encrypted at rest by Microsoft. It's called a platform managed key. But nowadays, a trend we have in Azure is that they're gradually allowing us, the customer, to manage our own encryption keys. That's a nice benefit for businesses whose security departments say, we can't do the cloud unless we can prove in our compliance checklists that we manage the associated keys and not the provider. Well, that's not a blocker anymore here because your Azure storage is always encrypted at rest and you can control the key. So I'll create that image, and now I've got, once this operation finishes, I now have a template for a custom VM that I've spent time lovingly creating and crafting in my on-premises environment. So now when it comes to deploying a virtual machine, I'm not stuck with starting with an Azure Marketplace template. I can go to Add. I'll put this new VM in the Pluralsight resource group, and I'll call it Win 2016. Can put it in any region I want. This is just going to be a question of your data sovereignty needs and your latency tolerance. We can choose different ways to make the virtual machine highly available. Availability zones are good if your region supports them. This means you can place VMs in separate data centers. So if we had, for instance, a plan to do 3 web servers that were going to be load balanced, we would want to put each of those nodes in a separate availability zone. That's going to keep your VMs and keep their services online, even if there's a failure of 2 of 3 entire data centers in your region. So it's a lovely thing. Now, here's the image selector. These are just the most popular Linux and Windows templates. And then if we click Browse All Public and Private, we go out to the marketplace where there's Microsoft and third-party templates that some have software pre-installed, some don't. As you see, there's a huge collection of categories. But we're going to go to My Items. It looks like it's not ready quite yet. Oh, nuts. I had a problem. Sorry. Oh, yeah, that is Amazon. What's her name? Alexa. Bye, Alexa. Well, nuts. I don't know. This would require some troubleshooting, but that's certainly a task of the Azure administrator, isn't it? We would just click into here and start to drill in to see what the problem was. But what I was hoping to show you is that when we flip over to My Items, we've got our image here, and off we go, and then we can complete the deployment. We don't have time to hit every single option, but again, size, it's just a question of looking at the different families. The VM sizes are divided into families or categories. In fact, you can customize the view here by using these filters. And the idea here is if you're doing workloads that are maybe heavily graphical, like processing video files, you might want a GPU emphasized virtual machine. Or maybe if you're doing big data analytics with Apache Spark, there's hosted stuff for that in Azure. There's Azure Databricks, and there's, well, Databricks is what I would choose first for Spark, but that's a memory optimized workload. You see, confidential compute, ultra high security, every bit of code that runs on that virtual machine needs to be explicitly allowed. So it's worth your studying as an Azure administrator, and it's all in the docs. If you just do a search for Windows VM sizes Azure, Linux VM sizes Azure, you can read all about it. But they're all different weightings of CPU, RAM, number of data disks. IOPS is the performance metric for storage input-output operations per second. And then a cost per month, importantly, an estimated cost in your local currency depending upon what your region is. Again, I just want to highlight that the size you choose is provisional. Of course, when you change the size, it changes the billing, but it also causes a restart of the VM, so that's something to be concerned with. Depending upon whether it's Windows or Linux, you've got different options for authentication. This must be a Linux image that I selected because it's giving me SSH as an option. Networking is another whole kettle of fish to be concerned with as an Azure administrator, as I said earlier about the question of public IPs in particular. Storage, again, you just need to know. I guess there's a lot of assumed knowledge here, isn't there? Once you start getting in fact, the work I've done, I don't have a lot of time because I'm a Pluralsight full-timer, but the little bit of time I have for consulting work and my free time, it's mainly training, I found, more than anything else. It's businesses being afraid because they don't know, for instance, offhand what the distinction or ramifications are of choosing standard HDD versus standard SSD and premium SSD. So you're really going to add a lot of value to your career, to your current place of work, or your future place of work by putting in the reps, so to speak, to be in the Azure docs learning about these, because you're bringing huge value. Because, a lot rides on this. That's cost, there's security, there's big implications to all this assumed knowledge. Speaking of which, I remember earlier in the Pluralsight Microsoft partnership, they told us that their Microsoft's number one Azure support tickets, the volume is with networking, and that comes as no surprise to me. I don't know about you. Yeah, the question of where to place your virtual machine, how you're going to protect the virtual machine, those are critically important tasks. And again, by you putting in the reps and mastering those skills, you're bringing enormous value to whatever business takes you on. Okay, I'm going to bail out of here and just jump in our remaining, looks like 12 minutes or so. I'm going to pick on one of my running VMs here. And we can see on the overview page, there's no public IP address, and it's getting a private non-routable IP address from the virtual network that this guy is living on. Now, I do not have a virtual private network between my office here in Nashville, Tennessee, and this VM that's running in East US 2, which, what is that? I think it's in Austin, Texas. I don't know. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. That's the abstraction of the cloud. Long story short, if I go to connect RDP to try to do a remote desktop connection, this is a private address that will never work on the internet. So there's the question, how do you manage virtual machines when, for security reasons, you don't want them directly exposed? Well, last fall at the Ignite 2019 conference, Microsoft introduced Bastion, which, as you can see here, is essentially a turnkey jump host where I can simply provide credentials that are good on that virtual machine. And I could do SSH if this were a Linux virtual machine. This is a Windows one, so it's RDP. But the magic here is that we're able to get in here, and I know you might have a strong opinion against GUIs. I don't want to go down that particular road. But just if you need to get in and do some work, it's if nothing else, it's a convenience to be able to get in and get a terminal session or a desktop session without having to snake over the internet or anything like that. All right, again, I want to keep time in mind here, so let me come back to the slides. And let's take a look at some Azure IaaS skills development for the Azure administrator. This is an important slide. If you go to some IT job sites, I did some research this past week looking at a whole bunch of Azure Administrator job postings. I went to dice.com, I went to LinkedIn Jobs, I went to Indeed. I just did a search, first of all, to figure out what the most popular IT job search sites are. Then I drilled in on Azure Administrator postings, and I want to reveal these trends that I observed. First, I don't know if I want to say most, but a large number of these Azure Administrator postings are listed as contract engagements. And I suspect businesses may be afraid to hire people who are paper tigers. They might have a certification, but they don't have any real world skills. I can work with that myself. The big problem is people who misrepresent their Azure skill set. And then after they've been taken on, you realize, oh my gosh, they actually don't know what they're doing. Don't be that person. So your task, it seems to me, is first of all to get clarity. Is this really a contract-only position, or is it potentially contract to hire? And then it's internal, convincing the employer that you are in fact worth hiring full-time. Another trend is remote work. Obviously, with COVID-19 pandemic, that's kind of been forced upon all of us. And you might have learned, actually, unfortunately, the hard way through pain, that work from home is not for everyone. I'm grateful that it is for me. I've been a full-time remote worker for like 12 years now. I can tell you that if you're struggling, you may be a good fit for work for hire, you're just not through the learning curve yet. Because if your experience with work from home is anything like mine was, it took several months before I developed any kind of rhythm in a remote work environment. So please don't beat yourself up if you're struggling extra hard. You may determine that work from home or remote work isn't for you. And once we're back to some kind of normalcy after this, you might decide that you don't want to do remote work, and that's totally fine. So your task here is to kind of inventory yourself and assess your own fitness for work. What's cool I like about Azure is that you can do it all from your pajamas if you want to, because it's all virtual. As long as you have a network connection and your tools, you can do Azure administration from anywhere in the world. I kind of like that myself. Another job posting trend, hybrid skills. That is to say, I see lots of Azure buzzwords and calls for Azure experience, but I also see lots of local experience, especially Windows Server. It would make sense, it seems to me, that Azure administrator job posting would be from a business that's predominantly a Microsoft technology stack shop. So you might see Exchange Server, Windows Server, Active Directory, domain services. No real big surprise there, but that leads you to think about the hybrid cloud scenario, and that's one of the great geniuses of Azure, the fact that it was built from the beginning to support a hybrid cloud scenario. And again, we have some potential heavy lifting. Ethernet, TCP/IP. I find that sometimes these skill lists and these Azure admin job postings almost turn into, it might as well just say other duties as required. It's like everything but the kitchen sink. And actually that problem kind of feeds into the next point I'm going to make. Well, first though, your skill here is a reminder to represent your skill set honestly. That's paid off huge dividends for me. During a tech or a stress interview, especially during a tech interview, if you're trying to put something over them, you know it's going to be exposed. And if your knowledge gap isn't something that you confront with them right up front, you might get past the interviews, maybe. You might even get past the job offer and start working, but you know, as good old Shakespeare said, the truth will out. That's been my experience. So it's best to be honest. Widely variable requirements. This is a big trend here. You know, with local traditional IT, there's the question about what constitutes a senior job role. You don't see senior Azure admins yet. I think it's still, we're early days with that. Likewise, I generally don't see much of any distinction in that realm like you might normally with a systems administrator job. And I often see in these job postings blendings that go outside of what you might strictly think of as an administrator sandbox and references to software development lifecycle and even management. I myself am an individual contributor. I know that about myself. I'm not really interested into the management thing. So that, if I saw that, that would be something I would follow up with very quickly. But the development, that kind of, I don't know, I would encourage you not to just dismiss a job posting that references development, because as I said during session 1 in shifting your paradigm, it's very easy to blur the lines among these different job roles in a place like Azure. And when you're working with a business that's gradually getting more into Azure, just by definition, it's early days and you don't have those really hard and fast job silos, generally speaking, where each person needs to stay in their own little sandbox. I mean, it can happen, of course, but I just wanted to surface that point, just something for you to consider. Again, your task here would be to communicate your questions and expectations clearly. Don't make assumptions, as they say. All right, so what's this saying? This is showing some IaaS study interests. All right, so again, in that terms of keeping an inventory of yourself, what are you naturally good at from an aptitude standpoint? Maybe you've always been a maker or handy, so compute, hardware, and even software is fine. Maybe even storage. You've set up home media centers at home, whatever the case may be, but maybe you're weaker in the networking stuff. That tends to be pretty standard, I find. The great thing about performing that self-inventory is that, number one, you don't have to do it yourself, because as I'm leading up to, we've got some tools at Pluralsight to help with that. But number two, what is that I think the old sage Dr. Phil said, that if you're aware of something, you're halfway to overcoming it. That's what I'm getting at. So to that point, you may want to consider looking at another more basic certification before jumping for Azure Fundamentals. For instance, CompTIA A+ is a vendor-neutral credential that deals with basic hardware, computer hardware and software maintenance. CompTIA Network Plus, that's the network stuff, Ethernet, TCP/IP, etc. You might think, well, I don't know, I'm kind of suspicious of certifications. Here's what I would counter with. If you know that you're going to need to invest the time, money, and effort to build your skills, say with TCP/IP and Ethernet, why not get the additional bonus of an industry certification? Because you'll be putting in the reps anyway. Why not go that extra little bit to qualify on the exam and get the cert? Because those certs are, nowadays, they're all verified. It used to be back when we would hike to and from the testing center uphill both ways in the driving rain, that you'd pass your exam and 2 months later you'd get a paper certificate. Not much verification with that in today's day of Photoshop. So these badges, the Azure badges, the CompTIA badges, are verified. So you can share a link with a potential employer, and they can get validation directly from Microsoft or CompTIA that you have in fact earned that credential. And so what we're dealing with in the Azure world, you could go on the fundamentals level. There's Azure Fundamentals. The associate is where Microsoft breaks out the different job roles, and there's a few different expert level certifications. There's DevOps engineer, there's solutions architect. What's a little misleading about this diagram is that those little dotted lines might make you think that there's prerequisites. That's not true. In fact, I'd like to erase the dotted lines and keep the solid ones. The DevOps engineer is the only certification that does have a prerequisite. You have to have earned either the Azure Administrator Associate or the Azure Developer Associate to qualify. And then you have to pass the AZ400 exam to get your DevOps Engineer Expert badge. But all of the other ones are freestanding and independent. So you can start where you are and then work from there. Now, what was I saying about Pluralsight tools? I'm going to, in the interest of time, jump ahead here. Again, you've got the whole slide deck at your convenience. It's in the GitHub repository. I told you just a little bit about the role IQ and the skill IQ. I want to hammer home on this in the last minute or so before I turn to questions and answers. What we've got here again with Role IQ is an overall evaluation that brings in machine learning. Our machine learning algorithm is called Iris. And the Role IQ will give you a measure. I think it goes beginner, level 1, level 2, level 3, a quantitative measure of your expertise level in a particular job role. And the one we're concerned with is Microsoft Azure Administrator. And if you look in the lower left of the screenshot, I showed you this last week, I think there's 4 skill paths that we have in our library for Azure Administrator. You'll want to start by getting your skill IQ for each one of those. It takes maybe, it's like 20 questions or so. The exams are adaptive, which is pretty cool. So if you answer a question that the engine assumes to be easier, it'll start to ramp up. If you start missing questions, it'll ramp down. So it's adaptive to your current skills. And again, that helps you with your self-inventory because you get a quantitative report. Are you novice, proficient, or expert? And then, of course, that leads you into our actual courses. And in future sessions, I have lots of tips to help you studying with our courses because this sounds kind of funny, but if you date back as long as I do you remember that Hair Club for Men commercial? That dude was like, I'm not only the Hair Club for Men president and founder, I'm a customer. Well, I'm not only a Pluralsight author, but I'm a daily Pluralsight student. So I spend a lot of time with the tools from a student's perspective as well. Okay. Alrighty, well, I hope that you found that helpful. That went a lot faster than I thought it would. Let me come over to a slide that would serve as a nice backdrop for now. And Alyssa, do we have any questions in the queue at this time?
Yeah, we do. We have a bunch. We have about 19 right now, and I'm sure there will be a few more trickling in. So
great.
For the first one, hello Tim. I'm a computer science student. I graduated just 1 year back. I'll be working as IT support in the university, and I'm comfortable with fundamentals of computer science, programming, and networking. I'm planning to make the transition to Azure Administrator and just started with Azure 1 month back. I'm also planning to give Administrator and CCNA, which is a suggestion from your Azure Admin Crash Course. What is the time frame for me to be job ready after certifications, and what else do I need to learn more for being job ready?
Okay. The job readiness, I hesitate to give any number of months of experience, let's say. None of the Azure exams have a hard prerequisite. Some IT certifications do, like project management and security, where you have to document experience length. It's not like that in the Microsoft world. Depending on the job that you're looking for, they may have a hard or soft requirement in terms of length. So given that fuzziness, I guess my response again comes back to you and you performing these self-assessments to gauge your own readiness. Passing a certification is a way to meet a bar that you can share as a demonstration of your expertise. The skill IQ and role IQ stuff, again, those are quantitative metrics that you can share. But what I think is your challenge is to get your first break. When I look back at my career, it was my first break. In other words, you need to find a company that's willing to trust and take a chance on you, knowing that you're kind of green. I mean, there's no point in trying to fuzz the facts. If you're new, you're new. But you're obviously willing to learn and you're dedicated, and kudos to you. So the way to do this is to get your first break. And there's not exactly a magic to that. I would suggest you boost your professional networking as much as you possibly can. Attend Azure user groups, I guess all via Zoom now or virtually, but meet people in the industry through user groups. Make introductions at LinkedIn, for instance. Participate in community discussions on Twitter. Because I'm telling you, of all my professional engagements I've had over the last 21, 22 years, the decided majority came not through an application process and checking off a box I had such and so length of experience, but it was knowing somebody, making a personal connection, and then that trust involved of being willing to give you a break, and then it's up to you to prove yourself.
Great, thanks. Our next one is, I'm not sure if Tim will cover this, but I saw a quick demo of Network Watcher last night from an AZ900 training. Would Tim be able to show it for a topology map or just briefly mention it?
Yeah, I can show a topology map really quickly. Let me bring my browser back. Again, with so many monitors, it's hard to get my cursor going here. Okay. Yeah, in keeping with the theme that networking in Azure tends to be the heaviest lift for people, it's important to know a tool like Network Watcher in Azure because this is going to give you a whole set of tools to help you troubleshoot networking in Azure. And one of the neat things it has is the topology generator right here, where you can just drill into a resource group and select a network, and boom, there it is. This is especially handy if you're coming into an environment that you didn't design and you want to get a quick sanity check of how a virtual network is laid out. So we can see here these icons. It looks like there's one virtual network, looks like there's one subnet that's got a VM on it. It looks like we've got some custom routing going on. There's a network security group. There's a lot going on here. There's an Azure firewall instance. And what's cool about this diagram is that each of these little pictures is clickable. They're hyperlinked. So you can dive right in to those different elements. And another last thing I'll show is that this download topology button, you can download the image that it generates as an SVG file, which means that you can import it into, say, Microsoft PowerPoint, Microsoft Visio, or Lucidchart even, and you can use it to build your own Azure topology diagrams. I hope that was helpful.
Thanks. Our next one kind of circles back to where we were talking about your analysis of the market and looking into what's available out there. So how open is the market for first-time associates that don't have experience in Azure?
Again, this is just one person's professional opinion, but I think that you're at an advantage because of the large scale, I was going to say ignorance, and if I don't mean that in any pejorative way, but when I read a lot of the job postings, I see text that screams to me, the person who wrote this might not have been really clear what they were actually writing. So yeah, chances are you might know more about Azure than the people interviewing you, honestly. So I do see this as a greenfield opportunity for you, even if you have less experience in Azure. But I would recommend kindly not trying to take advantage in that way, but use it as an opportunity just to gain greater clarity with whoever it is that you might be interviewing with. Yeah, and it's going to really be up to you to prove yourself. And as I said last week, something like Azure, you need to be in an always learning orientation. If you're not a perpetual learner, honestly, I don't want to openly dissuade you from pursuing work as an Azure administrator, but can't imagine you're going to be happy. I'm glad I love this stuff. My grandpa said to me, I don't know how many years ago, I was a boy, he said, Timmy, if you can do something professionally that you would do even if you weren't getting paid for it, you found the right career. I remember that when I was 10 years old, and I'm going to be 50 in a couple days. Oh my gosh. But it's still just as valuable advice. I horse around with this stuff in my free time. I'm that kind of a nerd. Deal with
Awesome.
it.
Okay, on to the next one. So, do you think after 10 years that virtual machines, Windows, Linux servers would completely be out and we would only be using software as a service on the cloud? If not, what do you think infrastructure as a service would be continued to be used as instead of transitioning to containerization or software as a service?
Yeah, I mean, if we look starting at like 2005, which is when I remember, maybe even earlier, virtualization really starting to come to the forefront. Instead of having a stack of physical servers, you could have just a couple and all of your other servers were virtual. That was a big sea change. And then more recently, this tend toward, like you say, containerization. I don't know. I think it's still quite a bit off because really think of the theme of today's lessons. I've mentioned the term early days quite a bit. I don't know how many times I talk to professionals and I ask them, what are you doing in a cloud? Not necessarily Azure, but a cloud. And they'll tell you it's either not yet, it's a roadmap thing, or it's early days. it's too early to think in terms of that kind of extreme. So I see some of the big ripples in the industry, the virtualization, the containerization, and now we're starting to get a bit more mature in the public cloud. And the concept of serverless computing, where you can just host a code file and set it to run on a schedule or on a trigger, that gets more to what the questioner was asking about. But it's going to be a long, long way off. I mean, I was going to say go out to a restaurant. It's kind of a tough thing to do now, but you go to a restaurant and you see a point of sale system that's running Windows XP. That tells you that it's going to be a little while, I think, before we've got primary emphasis on the cloud.
Yeah, we definitely still have some software out there that's a little dated, but we're moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our next one. I have been following up on Azure and AWS updates and found that Azure is significantly slower than offering software as a services than AWS. What are your thoughts?
I guess I would ask the questioner for clarification on what he or she means by software as a service services. I mean, I would think just the opposite offhand, because Microsoft has the whole Microsoft 365 suite, which is nothing more than a cornucopia of software as a service products. If you go under the covers in Azure Active Directory, there's like 3,000 pre-done integrations with just about any software as a service product you can ask for, in terms of, like, if your business was going to use Concur, let's say, for expense tracking, you can set up a single sign-on integration in Azure Active Directory with just about no code. So I've always considered that openness to SaaS software to be one of Azure's strengths, rather than something that it lags behind on. I don't know. I'd love to have more clarification on the question.
Yeah, I'll let you know if anything comes up in the Q&A and they follow up on that one. Our next one is, I'm not sure if this will be covered in session 3, but how do IT professionals switch from IaaS to PaaS? What is the learning curve like in terms of learning new skills for the new paradigm?
Boy, that's a really nice question. That's pretty vast. I'm not sure how to let me see if I can teach with a diagram. Let me dial up a picture here. I've got this monstrosity of a Visio diagram. In fact, I'm happy to share this. Let me add this on one of my little note papers on one of my monitors to add the Visio to the GitHub repo, because I'm happy to share this with you. I like to teach from this. It's a Frankenstein's monster kind of diagram because it shows so much. It's not supposed to be well architected, but let's say, for example, you've got a monolithic application, and let me bring out my good old drawing tools here, where you've got a web front end, you've got a couple virtual machines running whatever, IIS or Tomcat or Apache, it doesn't matter. And then let's say that there's a back end, a data tier, and you've got everything running in VMs and you're running it all manually. A staged approach to move more towards a platform as a service orientation might be to see how you could, for instance, stand up an Azure App Service app that's running that software. And you don't have to knock out your virtual machines to do that. You can just stand up the App Service app and start testing. And just seeing the difference in behavior, the difference in capability, and importantly, cost difference between running that web front end in an app service hosted web app as compared to a VM. You could even go further to speak of microservices and decompose this using other Azure products. You could use function apps. You could use, there's a product in Azure called API management that just hosts API definitions. So you can start just a layer at a time to start to decompose the application from an infrastructure as a service orientation to platform. And just for the sake of conversation, if we said that this was a Microsoft Stack app and these were SQL Server VMs, there a natural fit might be to look at Azure SQL Database. And yet another trend we see in Azure nowadays are things like service endpoints and private link, which enables you to take products like Azure SQL Database, like App Service, and securely integrate them into your virtual network. So, I mean, there are really lots and lots of inroads and possibilities for that kind of transition from IaaS into platform. It's really nicely architected. I'm a huge fan, but the onus is on you to become aware of all this stuff, hence the need for training and continued development.
Thanks for walking us through that one. Our next one is, you mentioned Azure uses Hyper-V as its virtualization platform. Is it their own tweaked, optimized version, or is it the one that comes with Server 2016-2019?
Well, if I knew, I couldn't tell you due to NDA, non-disclosure agreement, but the good news is that I don't know for sure. My suspicion is that the servers in the Azure data centers are running a specialized version of Server Core. In other words, not off-the-shelf variety, a specialized version. But Microsoft is transparent. They're quite transparent about what they have in their data centers. In fact, if you do a search for, I think it's called Project Phoenix, Microsoft attempted to standardize how they're doing hardware, the hardware servers in their data centers. I don't think Phoenix is the name. I'll have to add it to that links list that I'm going to put in GitHub for you. But long story short, I don't know. Other than I've heard it's Windows Server Core, I don't know whether it's 2016 or 2019 or 2012 R2. It is Hyper-V, but then again, you're able to run Linux, so there's magic going on there. I would say that if you're looking for more information on what happens in the Azure data centers, do a search at YouTube and look up Mark Russinovich, the CTO of Azure. In fact, he did a Pluralsight play-by-play with Mark Manassi that they talk about Azure data center security. That's worth looking at. And also, Mark is just a great teacher. I admire him greatly. Look in YouTube because he's given presentations that are recorded there where he gives fairly significant details about how the servers and services are set up physically. Of course, he doesn't want to get too specific due to operational security, but it's better than nothing.
Next one. Hey, Tim, why don't we have Server Standard version? How do we apply existing Windows 2019 standard license to 2019 data center in Azure, parentheses, hybrid benefit?
Yeah, I'm grateful to say that that's beyond my pay grade. I don't get into licensing. But I'm not just going to short circuit your question either. How I would answer that question is I would dive into the docs because it really is all there. I would do something like Windows Server Hybrid Benefit docs. I tend to find that my search queries, if I throw docs on the end, I can normally get a great result in the first couple of links, as you can see here. Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server. So you can start to drill into the docs, and the docs are all open source. And I want to encourage you that if you do that and you don't find exactly the answer you want, and you do learn what the answer is, consider, see how I'm clicking edit? These are all open source docs. You can, using your GitHub account, edit and submit those changes back to Microsoft, and they may get merged. This is potentially a big deal for your career as an Azure administrator, because by contributing to the Azure docs, you're being an honest-to-goodness open source contributor, and you can tell future employees that you've contributed to, if it's their code base, or their documents library, it's their documents library. But again, that's a nice competitive advantage, it seems to me. What was the final thing I wanted to say about this? Oh yeah, right. If you don't get the answer to that question in the docs, you can always, wrong icon here, file a support ticket. I found even the free tier support in Azure historically is pretty helpful actually and surprisingly responsive. So I offer those as some ideas off the top of my head.
Our next one is, our Azure PowerShell commands for managing all Azure services are part of the AZ-104 exam?
Okay. Yes, you're going to see quite a bit of Azure PowerShell on your AZ-103 or 104. And if you don't know what those are the two versions of the Azure Administrator Certification exam. What I tell students as a general thing is that you should make sure that you've got intermediate PowerShell knowledge. The code you'll see on your exam goes beyond beginner level. It does. So how do you get that expertise? Actually, my friend and Pluralsight colleague Michael Bender's got a really great Pluralsight course called PowerShell Fundamentals. The reference book is by my friend and Pluralsight colleague Don Jones and my friend and Pluralsight colleague Jeff Hicks. They wrote Windows PowerShell in a Month of Lunches from Manning Publishing. That's pretty much the standard text if you're looking to get a baseline familiarity of PowerShell. And what edition is this? This, I think, is an older edition. Third? No, I think this is the latest. There's a new edition being written by another group of people, the next generation, that I don't think it's done yet, though. And that one is just focusing on PowerShell 7, the cross-platform PowerShell. Don and Jeff, historically, it's Windows PowerShell. But it doesn't matter, because one of the beautiful things about PowerShell is that it's domain agnostic. That is, once you learn the flow of the language and how to use it, you can then immediately start bringing it into your work in Azure. And a nice benefit of the Azure Cloud Shell that you can get to directly in the Azure portal is that it has all of the latest AZ modules already in there, loaded and ready to go. Lastly, I'll say that for your Azure certification exam, be prepared that you might see a little bit of Azure CLI. Azure CLI is a cross-platform command language, a shell language that is an alternative to Azure PowerShell. In some spots in Azure, you can only do certain things with CLI. In other spots in Azure, you can only do it with PowerShell. So you might want to get at least a beginner level of familiarity with CLI so you're not blindsided if you see a little bit of that code on your exam.
Thanks. Our next one is, can we upload a VHD file as transferring VMs from on-prem to Azure instead of using the migration service for production? If no, what additionally does the migration service do to the image?
Well, I did that, didn't I? I mean, I took a VHD and did a manual upload into the blob service of a storage account. To do that for a migration scenario, I don't advise because of the downtime that's involved in that. The benefit that the Azure Migration Service brings to the table is live migration. It's called Azure Migrate. And nowadays you can look at all these different migration goals that are in here. And the point is that in the server migration scenario, you can replicate your on-premises VMs where you're trickling those VHDs instead of just uploading the whole thing as a monolithic blob, and that's going to involve downing the VM, et cetera, et cetera. You can keep your production servers online locally, trickle them up into Azure, and once they're synchronized, once the replication is in a protected state, you can fail over into Azure. So, and all of that is hosted for you nowadays in the Azure Migrate service. So if I understood your question, there are two separate things. There's just transferring VHDs back and forth, which you can do with Azure Storage Explorer or AZ Copy, like I mentioned. Or there's honest-to-goodness server migration, which if you're looking for zero or near zero downtime, your spot to go into is Azure Migrate.
Got it. Our next one is, how do you back up applications and database only in IaaS, excluding OS from backup? And then there's a second part, but I'll let you tackle that first.
Okay. I'm not sure I have a recovery service vault created. Yeah, so I'm not going to be able to go further. But the answer to the question is that they're getting there. Assuming that you've got SQL Server running on your VM, and I know that may or may not be the case, but if you do, then the Recovery Service Vault, which is Microsoft's managed backup and disaster recovery product, it has a backup template in there specifically designed for VMs that are running SQL Server, so it can take care of that. If that's not getting you where you want to go, you can consider using a third party like Veeam, or actually Microsoft has the System Center Data Protection Manager. You can use an ordinary product that you're running locally already, or you can stand up a server running that enterprise backup software as a VM. This speaks to a bunch of things, but what I want to highlight back in this big old diagram is that one of the benefits of using, say, the Azure site-to-site VPN, like you see on the left part of this diagram, is that it's truly extending your local environment into the cloud. And so it seems to me if you've already got enterprise backup software running locally that you're happy with and you're able to back up the databases and the transaction log files and all of that stuff independent of the OS, in this context, this hybrid cloud context, you can reach out and touch and back up and work with those VMs all day long as if they were local. And the reverse is also true. If you've ever heard of a newer product in Azure called Azure Arc, that takes that kind of in reverse where you're centering your management in Azure and you're able to reach down and touch your on-premises servers and manage them. One additional note about Azure Arc is that it doesn't require a virtual private network. It uses web protocols. I hope that that response was helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And the second part of that is if deploying a single virtual machine, do we still need VNet and subnets before the deployment?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, you do. You do. And when you're creating a virtual machine, let's say like we were earlier, when you're going through the portal wizard, same rules apply if you're doing it programmatically though, but I'm going to show you the portal. If we go to the networking page, notice that it says that if you don't have, I didn't make enough selections for it to even fill it in, but normally if you filled in the previous screens where you've given a location, etc., it'll nominate, the template here will create a new virtual network for you and will place the VM on a subnet. And that's just to say, yes, you absolutely have to have the virtual network in place and your subnets defined before you can place the virtual machine on that VNet. And remember how I said earlier today that many things in Azure, if you don't make the best choice initially, you can always go back and refactor. That is true, but there are some things that are best done or can only be done at deployment. And if you don't get it right, you'll have to kind of scratch it and start again. Placing your VMs into a VNet is one of those things that if you were to place, let's say this hub VM1 should be over here in the spoke VNet and we accidentally deployed it to the hub, you can't just click the mouse a couple times or click your heels and all of a sudden the VM's in the correct VNet. No, it's a big problem actually. Pretty much you can either replicate it and fail it over, but chances are you would delete the VM and keep your disks and then just redeploy a new VM into the correct VNet. So there's an example of where you really want to make the right decision initially instead of having to clean it up later.
Our next one is, hey Tim, you showed us Bastion today. We have had issues with Azure Console, which seems like a cloud version of Serial Console. Can you add Bastion after the VM is created?
Yeah, absolutely you can. In fact, if you go to any virtual machine in your subscriptions, there's an option in the settings list actually under operations for Bastion. And if you don't have one deployed, you'll be prompted to create one. Unfortunately, bastions are VNet local, which is you can't share a single bastion across multiple, if you're using VNet peering, for instance, to connect virtual networks. You have to deploy N number of bastions, which can get expensive, unfortunately. But yeah, the long story short is you can set up a bastion at any time. So this server 1 VM is currently on a network that does not have a bastion, and all I have to do to deploy one is give it a name, as you can see here. The bastion does have to be on an empty subnet that has the name Azure Bastion Subnet, so you'd create that subnet manually. The bastion does take a public IP address, so it's going to consume that. And resource group and click create, give it 5-6 minutes and off you go.
Thanks. And a couple more questions about Bastion since we're on it. So do you know if it can be used in enterprise environments where they already have the private network per the policies set within the organization itself?
I'm missing what you mean by policy. If you're talking about RDP policy, no. In fact, I remember Microsoft was asked about that instantly at Ignite last year because the product team announced it and actually put it in general availability. And one of the very first questions is, well, we have security policy, group policy that we do that specifies RDP sessions, because really Bastion is a managed RD gateway, or what is it called, RD Gateway? The Remote Desktop Services Gateway. That's what it is. There's some additional magic in there because you're able to do SSH and RDP, but it's a multi-session RDP host is what it is. And when you set that up on premises, you can control through group policy all of its properties. That's supposedly on the product team's roadmap. It's been a little while though, hasn't it? But yeah, it's a roadmap issue. Unfortunately, all of that stuff is out of our reach. It's one of those trade-offs of the cloud. You can look at sessions and you can stop sessions, but as you can see in the control plane for Bastion, there's monitoring, of course. You can look at the log data and everything, but there ain't nothing here. It is completely managed by Microsoft. You can't even turn it off. That's another question that the product team got immediately. Can we save money by turning Bastion off when we don't need it? No, it has to stay running 24/7.
Got it. Our next one is, how does Azure Migrate take into consideration a VMware VM and conversion to a Hyper-V format?
Yeah, well, the short answer to that is that it does. The migration team knew right at the outset that they needed to support beyond Hyper-V. As a matter of fact, they put in the bits for supporting VMware before Hyper-V. So that'll tell you something. How does it work? Well, the Cliff Notes or the Reader's Digest condensed version is that you download a pre-configured virtual machine from Azure Migrate and you set it up in your vSphere environment. You have to have a vCenter environment. You have to have the vCenter orchestration in place for your VMware environment. But you stand up what's called the Azure Migrate server, and that serves as a local proxy. And it handles physical to virtual conversion. It handles the whole assessment phase of seeing what your VMs are and how they're equipped and whether they're suitable for Azure. It handles just about everything. And to add on top of that yet, the Azure Migrate Appliance Proxy uses TCP 443, so you don't have a requirement of a virtual private network or an express route link. It's not really nicely architected, no question about it.
Thanks. This one's from an anonymous attendee, and they said, if someone did not understand 70% of what you talked about today, do you think he should abandon following this path of Azure? I would say no way. What do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, hello, fellow anonymous. Yeah, that makes me sad as an instructor because, of course, the last thing I ever want to do is have anybody feel alienated or rage quit one of my classes or sessions. But yes, even though I've done my best to try to keep the tech level from getting too far into the weeds, it's almost impossible not to face overwhelm with this because, number one, let's take networking as a quick example. There's presupposed knowledge of Ethernet and TCP/IP internetworking, routing, switching, route tables, TCP protocols, port numbers. I mean, that in itself is a whole career. Then you bring that into Azure, and then there's learning how all of that pre-existing knowledge fits into software-defined networking in Azure. And that's just the networking subsystem, and that's really scratching the surface at that. So thanks for bringing that point up. My response is, if you would consider adding on to being a perpetual learner and that commitment, there's also the commitment, it seems to me, to breathe and to understand that the more you know, the more you don't know. How can I say this? The most important thing I know about Azure is that I have a glimmer of how vast my ignorance is, and that's okay. Because at the very least, if I don't know something, I know where to go and who to ask. That's another important prod for you to develop your professional networking and your connections so you have people to ask and to get into a research mindset. And the Azure Docs, I can't speak highly enough about those. Obviously, Pluralsight, we've got a vast library with some absolutely fantastic instructors. It's all in that skills development and stuff.
Thanks, Tim. Our next one is, asking now before I forget, will anything that has been announced at Microsoft Build 2020 so far impact the normal Azure administrator?
Probably. How's that? I've been pretty heads down with my Pluralsight work this week, honestly, so I was planning on catching up on build stuff after the effect, but I did see quite a bit bubble up yesterday about something called Winget, which looks to be a package manager that they're rolling into the Windows terminal. Windows terminal is certainly in scope for an Azure administrator, but anything like earth-shattering or paradigm shifting, nothing that's come up on my news feed yet, to be perfectly honest with you. So that can certainly change. So let's stay in touch. If you're not following my Twitter, Tech Trainer Tim, please consider doing so, because as I learn stuff, I just tend to reflexively share it on Twitter.
Got it, thanks. Our next one is, how can we create an IaaS workspace like the one you presented today?
Well, hopefully you don't want to get anywhere near as gnarly as this. But the smallest representation of this probably would be in the upper right here, where you could create a virtual network with one subnet and place one virtual machine on that subnet, and maybe add a network security group in and look at protecting the traffic to and from. That VM's probably going to get a little bit lonely, so you might want to consider adding another subnet and another VM and testing connectivity between those. That also brings up things like Bastion, because otherwise you'd be putting a public internet accessible IP address on your VM, and that's something that we want to be careful about, like I said before. Going there from there, you've got two VMs, but they're looking for community, so you could create another VNet and do a peering between those two VNets, right? If you want to get really crazy, maybe set up a site-to-site VPN between your home network and one of those virtual networks. There's a really great article. Let me see if I can really quickly find it. I know that we're starting to run short on time. Let me see. Azure site-to-site VPN Windows Server IaaS. By using a virtual machine, you know, on Windows 10, if you're running Windows 10 at home, you can do a Hyper-V server and create VMs just right there. This may be the article, but the bottom line is it's not too difficult actually. Assuming you have like a cable modem or a high-speed internet connection, you can use a virtual machine that you set up on your home computer, I'll assume Windows 10, and create a Windows Server VM that runs the routing and remote access service, and you can set the VM up as a router, and you can use that as your endpoint to a site-to-site VPN into Azure. You see what I mean? So gradually, as you start to learn, you can start to expand your horizons. Now, of course, all of this costs, and that's another whole discussion that I'm sure will be ongoing on ways that you can obtain free Azure credit or time in an Azure environment to do some of these things.
Thanks, Tim. Our next one is, what is the difference between standard SSD and premium SSD?
Right, actually now there's 4 stock keeping units or SKUs for Azure storage. And first of all, HDD is just mechanical storage, like a SCSI drive or a serial attached SCSI drive, the spinning disks. So it's cheaper, it's less expensive, but it's also less performant. On the other hand, premium storage is solid state storage, no moving parts, it's all memory-based storage. And there you're getting much higher performance, and it's also predictable. You know those IOPS I mentioned a little while ago about as a measure of disk performance? The numbers you get with HDD disks is a maximum, not an expected value. When you're doing premium storage, that's actually an expected value, and that can be really important as an administrator. If you need predictable storage for your VM, you might really want to look at investing the extra moolah for premium SSD. There's a midpoint actually nowadays called standard SSD that does give you the predictable performance of solid state, but a lower price point, closer to the HDD. And much more recently, there's a disk SKU called UltraDisk. I don't know too much about UltraDisk at this point, but I think some of its value propositions is you can actually adjust the speed, the IOPS value. You get more granular control over the performance of the storage. So there you go.
Our next one is, do you think customers moving to Azure Office 365 would significantly increase during these days?
Yeah, I've seen that myself, to be honest with you. I mean, with work from home and IT departments that might have been accustomed to working all together physically are now by definition distributed. I know for a fact many businesses have had to scramble to set up services like in a Microsoft stack. You might realize, my gosh, we need to get some kind of web conferencing, instant messaging stuff going. We've had these Microsoft 365 or Office 365 licenses just lying fallow. We now need to start using them. So yeah, the short answer to the question is there's been a huge uptick. And I've noticed in my work as an instructor, I tend to use East US 2 as my home region in Azure. The performance has gotten pretty darn slow, a lot more latency than usual. And that is definitely due to the increased volume of users in some of these regions. East US 2 happens to be one of the most popular regions, I think because it's one of the regions that Microsoft tends to put all of the latest and greatest features. When they're in preview, they tend to go in East US or East US 2 first. But yeah, you're not imagining things. It's this uptick we're seeing in O365 and Microsoft Cloud Platform. I'm sure Microsoft would tell you the same thing if you asked them directly.
It looks like we're just about at time, so we probably can't crank out any more questions. But if anyone has anything that wasn't answered this week, feel free to throw that our way next week. And thank you all again for joining us. It was great to see all of the familiar names and some new ones out there. And thank you again, Tim. It was great for you to host us and teach us.
My pleasure, Alyssa. Thank you. And thanks, everybody. I look forward to seeing you next week.